All right, so we're here at the Bagdad Cemetery in what is now Leander, Texas. At the time that this cemetery was founded, though, this was Bagdad, Texas, which is now a former ghost town that has been consumed by the urban sprawl of the Austin area. Now, if this sign looks familiar to y'all, it was featured in the original film Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is actually the cemetery that the characters come to when they hear reports of grave robbing and they want to check on their relatives' graves. Now, the one that they do actually check on in the film is one of the more prominent grave markers here in the cemetery. It is of Colonel C.C. Mason, and we'll definitely go check out that section of the cemetery here in a bit. Right off to the left here is actually the state historical marker for the Bagdad Cemetery, and we'll take a look at it really quick. So of course this was erected by the Texas Historical Survey Committee, and it reads, Bagdad Cemetery opened 1857 with the burial of 3-year-old John Babcock, whose father Charles later gave tract to community. Other early burials were Civil War veteran John Hale and Colonel C.C. Mason. Leander, founded 1882 when railroad bypassed Bagdad, shares use of this tract, enlarged in 1959 and 1966, and this was erected in 1972. All right, so as we make our way through the cemetery towards Colonel Mason's grave, that's going to be the first one that we look at today. It is somewhat of a tourist spot. Throughout the day, you will see numerous folks pull up, get their picture taken with it, things like that. It's pretty cool that the movie was filmed here north of Austin. The house was originally over in Round Rock, Texas, and then of course this graveyard here in Leander. So at the time that the film was made, this was actually the tallest grave in the cemetery. It still is. It definitely prominently stands out. Now, C.C. Mason, he was one of the founders of Bagdad. He came here in the early 1850s with a land grant. And during the Civil War, he organized and recruited for the 27th Brigade of the Texas State Troops. Now, these troops, what their purpose was to defend the state of Texas, the military district of Texas. And being out here on the frontier, their main concern was, of course, attacks from the Comanche tribes that lived on the Comancheria northwest and northwest of here. Now, during that period of the Civil War, the Comanches were actually very successful. They pushed back the line of settlement over 150 miles in some places. So these brigade troops, they were kept busy patrolling the area, trying to protect the settlements and maintain order, especially towards the end of the war when military authority and the authority of the Confederate States government fell apart. And they were also instrumental in maintaining order once the Union Army arrived, which is, of course, celebrated as Juneteenth Day. It was June 19th, 1865, when Union troops first landed in Galveston, Texas, and began the process of Union occupation of the state, but also freeing of the slaves. In addition to Colonel Mason's grave, you'll see a lot of others in the area marked Mason. Mason is a very prominent family here in the history of what is now Leander. And actually, even throughout modern Leander, you'll see his name on a lot of buildings, streets, neighborhoods. There's the Mason Hills subdivision. There's C.C. Mason Elementary School as well. Him and his family were very influential in first the settlement of Bagdad, and then once the railroad bypassed Bagdad, now follows the course of U.S. Highway 183, Leander, a lot of businesses and homes moved closer to the railroads, and they helped found what is now Leander, Texas. Continuing on past the Mason family plot, we have the grave of Joseph and Sarah Highland. Now, what's really interesting about this family is you'll see that there's 3 unique markers here on this gravesite that are pretty common yet also rare in Texas cemeteries. And going from right to left, first I want to show you this cross bearing the badge of the Texas Rangers. That signifies that Joseph was a former ranger, served in the defense of the Republic of Texas at the time. And then the next one over shows that Joseph was a citizen of the Republic of Texas. There is also one for Sarah as well. Now, they came to Texas in 1829, a few years before the Revolution, and they initially settled down in Austin's colony. And right there on the left, you see the Texas Revolutionary War veteran emblem for Joseph. Now, he enlisted in the Army of Texas on February 29th. Now, Colonel Travis, of course, wrote his famous letter from the Alamo requesting reinforcements on February 24th, and it was delivered the next day in Goliad, and it was then printed and distributed. Now, there's no proof of this, but I would like to believe that Joseph heard his letter read aloud and enlisted in the defense of Texas during the Revolution. And Joseph then served in the Battle of San Jacinto just about 6 weeks after the Battle of the Alamo. And of course, that is where Santa Anna's army was completely routed and Texas independence was won. And Joseph actually, as a part of his service, he received a land grant of 640 acres. It was called headright. And he actually used that grant to settle out here in Williamson County in the early 1850s. This monument right here is actually for Private William Carruthers. And what's very interesting about this one is the story behind Private Carruthers. So he served in Baylor's Cavalry Regiment, which was recruited out of the Central Texas area, and they mainly served in southern Arkansas and northern Louisiana, helping defend against Union incursions into those two states. Now, William was actually wounded in early 1864. It was a fatal wound, but he was actually able to tie himself onto his horse, and he rode towards home here in what is now Williamson County, and he actually made it here. And unfortunately, he did pass away a couple days after his arrival, but he was able to make it home. And it's very interesting because there are very few Civil War casualties that are buried here in this part of Texas, as it was not part of the front lines of campaigns. Now, of course, Texas played a big part in not only the Civil War, but also in the subsequent wars that came in the 20th century, including World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And this right here is the marker for PFC Noah Loman. He was a PFC in the 357th Infantry Regiment in World War II. And as you can see, he was killed in action on March 23rd, 1945. Now, when I did some brief research on this regimental history, that was actually the day that the 357th Infantry crossed the Rhine River into Germany. Now, this, of course, came towards the end of World War II, and the German army had their backs against the proverbial wall, and they were no longer defending the occupied countries of Western Europe. They are now defending what, they considered their homeland, and they put up a very tough fight. And men like, PFC Loman, they had to fight their way first across the Rhine River and then try to hold it against the numerous German counterattacks. And actually, during the crossing of the river that day, this regiment was actually strafed by numerous German Messerschmitts who inflicted casualties, but nevertheless, the men did move on. They established a bridgehead on the eastern shore of the Rhine River, which then allowed other units of the United States Army to cross the river in relative safety and then push forward into Germany, especially central Germany, and eventually end the war. Now, as we move on to our next grave site, you can kind of see some of the growing urbanization in the area. But we're coming over here, we're looking for Private Dwight Amidon's grave marker, and I believe this is it. It is. Now, Dwight was only 20 years old when he enlisted as a private in the Confederate States Army. He served in the 6th Texas Infantry Regiment, which is most notable for participating in numerous campaigns in the Western Theater, but especially the Battle of Chickamauga. Now, Chickamauga, which was fought in September of 1863, it was the second bloodiest battle of the entire war, behind only Gettysburg. And it's also significant because it was one of the very few Confederate victories in a major engagement during the course of the war in the Western Theater. It came amidst a string of Union victories at, Vicksburg, Fort McHenry, and the Union Army had cut the Confederate states in half, and they were looking to move into northwestern Georgia and eventually capture Atlanta before moving on to capture the port of Savannah. Now, in their way stood a Confederate army, of which the 6th Texas was a part of. And during the 3-day battle, they were in the thick of some of the heaviest fighting. They suffered almost half of their regiment killed or critically wounded. The 6th Texas did repulse numerous Union attacks before the Union Army retreated back into central Tennessee. Now, Of course, about 1 year later, the Union Army was successful in taking Atlanta, and then General Sherman was able to complete his march to the sea, capturing Savannah and presenting it as a Christmas present to President Abraham Lincoln. Now, there at Chickamauga, the Union forces were led by General Grant, with General Sherman as a corps commander underneath him, and it remains one of the few losses in either one of their military careers. Now, coming up right here, this grave marker on the left, it is for Crockett Collier. He was a private that served in the 17th Texas Infantry Regiment. Now, with a name like Crockett, he was born in 1844. I mean, I'm going to guess he was named after the legendary Colonel Davy Crockett, hero of the Alamo and king of the wild frontier. Now, the 17th Texas Infantry that Collier served in, they were part of Walker's Greyhound Division. They were called the Greyhounds because they are most known for moving long distances entirely on foot. They moved all over both the Western Theater and the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the war. And the two most significant actions that they took part in was, first, they were at the Battle of Vicksburg and the Siege of Vicksburg. They were able to fight their way out of it. And then their second one was actually at the very end of the war. They were ordered to Hempstead here in Texas, where they were actually waiting on the arrival of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. They were going to be his personal guard as the Confederate Army made their last stand. And of course, President Davis never made it anywhere close to Texas. He was captured by Union forces. And after news of the Confederate surrenders across the Eastern and Western theaters, the Greyhound Division was mustered out of service in mid-1865 without incident. This grave marker is actually for Private Samuel Wilson. You can see it's pretty worn down and weathered. He was born in 1841, died 1868. Now, Private Wilson served in the 4th Texas Infantry Regiment during the Texas Civil War, which was part of the famous Texas Brigade, also known as Hood's Brigade. Now, this was one of the first units organized here in the state of Texas, and they arrived on the eastern seaboard to take part in the Eastern Theater of the War in late 1861. And upon their arrival in Richmond, President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually gave a speech extolling their virtues of Texans. He noted that they were the sons of the defenders of the Alamo, sorry about that, and stated that they had a high reputation to live up to, while other states still had to earn their reputation as fighting men. Now, the Texas Brigade was known as the shock troops of the Army of Northern Virginia throughout the war. They were consistently given some of the toughest assignments in each campaign and in each battle. And during the Battle of Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, which was the bloodiest day in the history of the United States military, the Union Army actually broke a hole through the Confederate lines, and it was the Texas Brigade that was sent to counterattack to hold the line. So there was one brigade of Texas infantry against 2 corps of Union troops, so they were heavily outnumbered, but they were able to throw the Union Army back, and they stabilized the Confederate lines, which allowed the battle to end in a stalemate instead of just a rout of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, following that, they also participated in the Battle of Gettysburg, during which they fought in the Devil's Den. Now, this was an area between Little Round Top and Big Round Top. It was scattered with a lot of rocks, boulders, things that made for a great defense of the Union troops there. And the Texas Brigade, it was extremely heavy fighting. They were able to take the area, and then after capturing the area, they actually used those same rocks and boulders as cover, and the sharpshooters began picking off Union troops that were on top of the 2 round tops, including killing a Union general. Now, when I was exploring this cemetery, this grave marker in particular really stood out to me. It is the family grave of the McClure family, Zach and Bessie. And now Zach in particular, as you can see, he was a Freemason. But when we look here, he was actually a sergeant in Company I of the 360th Infantry Regiment in World War I. Now, this is a very personal connection to me, because my great-grandfather, Jess Newton, also fought in Company I of the 360th Infantry Regiment in World War I. So it's crazy for me to think that this gentleman right here, he wound up in the same town as I am right now, and he definitely would have known my great-grandfather, who I never had the pleasure of meeting. He passed away in the early 60s. long before I was born. Now, the 360th Infantry Regiment, and in particular Company I, they did have a very distinguished record in World War One. They first fought in the Saint-Mihiel offensive, and then eventually the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and these two combined are known as the 100 Days Offensive. Now, this was very fierce fighting that eventually broke the back of the German army and forced Imperial Germany's surrender with the armistice of 11 November, which ended the war to end all wars. Now, during this fighting, Company I, it was very brutal trench warfare. It was hand-to-hand combat numerous times. They had to charge across open fields that were covered by machine guns, which were firing on them from all directions. There was German snipers, landmines. Every inch of territory in the no man's land was zeroed in by German artillery. They were also strafed by German aircraft. And unfortunately, Company I was also subjected numerous times to mustard gas from the German army. Nevertheless, they did persevere. They did fight on for our country, and they did eventually succeed in defeating the Germans and ending the Great War. Right here, we do have the grave of Lorenzo D. Hatton. He lived to be 90 years old. He was born in 1822. Now, he was a Mason, but one of the things I find most interesting about him was that even though we're here in Texas, he was actually a veteran of the Union side on the Civil War. He served in the 16th West Virginia Infantry Regiment. Now, West Virginia was not a state at the beginning of the Civil War, but when the state of Virginia seceded from the Union, West Virginia seceded from Virginia. So they became their own state, and in 1862 to 1863, which is when the 16th West Virginia was in service, they were responsible for guarding Washington, D.C. They played a huge part in the defense of our nation's capital, but they also served as a deterrent to Robert E. Lee's aggression during his invasions of the North in both 1862 and 1863. This is the Johns family plot, and you can see over there on the far right, you have the patriarch J.R. and his wife Maggie, and to their left are their three sons, Harvey, Johnny, and James. Now, the two I really want to look at today are these two brothers, James and Johnny. Now, James, he served as a private in the 145th Infantry Regiment of the 37th Infantry Division. You can see he's a pretty good-looking fella. He's got his crossed rifles there, as all proud infantrymen do. Now, there in July of 1944, the 145th Infantry Regiment was pretty heavily engaged, fighting in the Pacific. They were trying to fight their way towards the Philippines. It was very intense fighting that they took part in. There was a lot of jungle fighting, and as was unfortunately pretty common when fighting the Japanese army, the Japanese fought until they were absolutely decimated. It wasn't just a matter of outmaneuvering them and forcing them to retreat. They did have to destroy entire units. And during the Battle of Bougainville, during which Private James was killed in action, the 145th Infantry Regiment actually completely decimated multiple battalions of Japanese infantry. And then right next to him, we have his brother, Johnny, who was also an infantryman. He served in Company K, the 29th Infantry Regiment, during the Korean War. You can see he's also a pretty good-looking fella. And now, he was killed in action July 27th in 1950. It was a pretty infamous incident, unfortunately. It was just over a month after North Korea had invaded the South. They had completely overrun the vast majority of the country. And the 29th Infantry Regiment were some of the first American reinforcements to arrive on the Korean Peninsula. They arrived from Okinawa, and upon landing, they were almost all brand new recruits who were assigned newer NCOs and officers, such as Staff Sergeant Johns here. And they had no cohesive unit training. They did not have any modern equipment. They lacked even basic communication equipment, such as radios. And they were ordered north towards the advancing North Korean army. And just 2 days after their arrival on the Korean Peninsula on the 27th, they were in the Hedong region. And it was two ridges on either side of a pretty shallow valley that the 29th Infantry walked into, and they were ambushed by heavily dug in North Korean forces. They were hit hard by armor, artillery, mortars, heavy machine gun fire as well. Now, Staff Sergeant Johns, he was in Company K. They were actually second in the line of march of the battalion. And when they saw the lead company, which was Company L, got hit hard and was pinned down, Company K actually counterattacked directly into the North Koreans, just in an attempt to get as many of their comrades out of the line of fire as possible. It is unfortunate, but during this ambush, 307 men of the battalion were killed and 495 were wounded. This constituted about 100% of the battalion was wiped out. Now, just less than a week after this battle happened, the remainder of the infantry regiment, of the 29th Infantry Regiment, the 1st and 2nd Battalions, actually fought the North Koreans in a battle, and they had received modern equipment, communications equipment, armor, artillery, and they were given air support, and they were able to handily defeat the North Koreans, which helped stabilize the Pusan perimeter and eventually allowed the U.S. and South Korean forces to counterattack and drive the North Koreans back north. Now, with these two brothers, they were killed in action almost 6 years to the day apart. James on July 26th, Johnny on July 27th. And, you know, it's hard to even comprehend what their parents, JR and Maggie, went through the second time. They had already gone through this once with James and probably thought it would never happen to them again. And then, unfortunately, they got that second telegram about Johnny.